think Scotland is a colony.
Okay.
And one of the reasons, so I think Scotland is subordinated to England, but in part it becomes subordinated also through the actions of the Scottish elite, because they're the ones who join into that union, and they join it, and they agree. And again, I would need to do more research on this, but from what I remember is that they join it agreeing to having less representation in Westminster in return for having lower taxes on the Scottish population. So they make a trade-off saying, well, we don't want representation. What we want is lower taxes. And so we'll agree to this. And so the fact that Scotland has less power in Britain is partly because of that wish to not pay tax. When you compare the history of England's relationship to Scotland to England's relationship to Ireland, for example, one of the things that you see is that when you have the English Civil War and Cromwell's conquest of Ireland in the 17th century, one of the ways in which that conquest is funded is through private investment. So the English nobility are told, invest in the army, give us the resources, and when we defeat Ireland, you'll have access to the land. And that's what happens. And many Scots also come to Ireland and take the land in that sort of process. And after the famines in Scotland in the late 17th century, I think it's something like 200,000 Scots leave and also go to Ireland and have access to land through the Protestant ascendancy and so on, the whole Ulster Scots stuff. And when they're doing this, one of the things that they're also saying, and that those who are then supporting the king in the Civil War are trying to get money from the king to fight against the Cromwellians and so on. And they're saying, well, look, if we win and we take Ireland, what we'll do is establish a quit rent, a land rent in Ireland that will fund all of your household expenses, and you won't need to tax your subjects. So Irish people were never seen as the king's subjects, even though there was that sort of thing, and so there was that distinction. So Ireland was taxed purely for the benefit of England, whereas that relationship doesn't appear to have been so clear-cut in Scotland. So I accept that Scotland was subordinated to England, but I wouldn't see it as a colony. And the two places that are most similar are Ireland and India. The way England and then Britain deals with both Ireland and India is more similar than the way in which England deals with Scotland.
I guess the thing is, looking at it from my historical perspective, is that in a way the taxation has been the population. The population has gone. We were a much larger proportion of the population for a long time, and we've paid our taxes via people. And also, obviously, and I think this is becoming increasingly obvious to other people in the rest of the UK, through our natural resources as well. Yeah. And, I don't know if you're aware of this, but, we have a growing number of food banks. And I have a little illustration on my Instagram of, food banks surrounded by oil rigs. And this is really something that you also see in likes of Nigeria and places like that. And so, I guess that's the taxation that I see. And I'm trying desperately to bring up this document of a book that I started reading a long time ago called The Liberty Tree. And it's about John Muir. I forget the man's name, but he was actually in Leith Docks fighting against, the English army that were up there because they were exporting grain out of Scotland when Scots were starving. So there's definitely those mechanisms were in place. But, Robert Burns obviously, called them a parcel of rogues, the Scottish elite who handed over Scotland. And, in the day that it happened, I know historically there were riots in the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. So it wasn't felt as it wasn't a happy moment for the working classes, but clearly it was a sop to the elites.
I mean, it's really interesting because actually you saying that reminds me that a colleague of mine who's Scottish did say also the same thing, that during the famine grain was being brought. So I don't know that history, and I don't know what the relationship of England to Scotland at that time was. And was the issue that there were English landlords or whatever in Scotland who were then able to take that grain out? So that would obviously complicate it. I think what sort of confuses the picture is the extent to which the Scottish population involves itself in what becomes the British Empire. And, so because in a way, if you look at, particularly at settler colonies, the ones that become, so apart from the US, all other settler colonies have Scottish institutions, Scottish law, Scottish, etc. And in part, that's because it was Scots who went there and administered empire. So they became that middle rung in a way of or that was their access to Westminster, was often through empire. So all the ones who end up in Westminster have spent 10, 20 more years in empire and stuff as well. So it's a really complicated relationship.
There's this problem where elites, or a proportion of them, have this sense, they don't have this sense of home, which perhaps working class people have. So, they're more mobile via their wealth. So they don't have this sense of home. And, the Duke of Sutherland, for example, probably be held up as that kind of figure. But, equally, I would go back to Robert the Bruce, whose family had lands in France, I believe, as well. So, a lot of the English elites as well also had lands in France. So they didn't have that same sense of home that I think brings that's more of a sense of security for the whole population if the elites feel that this is also their home too.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the distinction between, I was saying before that the people, I think it was mostly from Glasgow, who were involved in this cotton, tobacco and sugar plantations in the West Indies. They create these estates in northwest Scotland which are private and so on, whereas the Scots who enter the East India Company and end up going to India, they're from they're doctors, they're solicitors, they're lawyers, they're army people, they're regular professional classes or whatever, not the elite. And when they come back, they distribute their wealth across the entire population. So there is, so there's a different sense of home, absolutely, for them than there would necessarily be for the barons.
I think your point about the Scots being involved in empire is something that we have to address, and I think for me that's what flips me from the side of Scotland not being a colony, because the colonizers don't take in a role as heavily as they did. And I actually live in Barcelona, and I was speaking to one of my friends just a few months ago, and I said to him, has Spain ever had a Catalan prime minister? And he burst out laughing, and he said the chances of Spain having a Catalan prime minister seem fanciful. And I said, that's interesting, because the UK has had several Scottish prime ministers. And he said to me, but that's because you embraced this idea of empire in the United Kingdom. And for me, it was a real moment to look at that. And he said, there's no or very few senior Catalan judges, and the Spanish state almost seems very separate from Catalonia in the way that the British state isn't separate from Scotland. And I found that, another fascinating perspective as we're looking at what makes a colony and who is colonized.
I mean, I think the other thing that perhaps is significant is that at least after the Act of Union, as far as I know, there were no famines in Scotland. Whereas you do have the Irish famine in 1848, and you have so many famines in India where people are allowed to die, So I think that's also one distinction, that the people who are in the colonies, where they are seen as colonies, are not regarded as subjects and are allowed to die in horrific numbers. So in Ireland, you have 1 million dying and 1 million emigrating. In India, from the time that the British state takes over control in the 1850s through till 1945, basically, I would say that probably 20 to 40 million people die of starvation. That's directly consequence of colonial processes, because again, grain is being taken out of India during the most horrific famines, allowing people to die, and that grain is being used to support. So the fact that you know, so that's one, however terrible the conditions of the working class were in Scotland and England from the 1700s onwards, there was the most basic thing that they weren't allowed to die from famine in the numbers that those in the colonies were.
I thought that there was a famine in Scotland after the Union, so there was. Yeah. So that the Highland potato famine was a period of 19th century Highland and Scottish history, 1846 to roughly 1856. So over
but
which
not to the extent. Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? It looks like it's kind of like a, you know, like a gradient. The semantics really that we're discussing, because we're all subordinate to this idea of the British Empire, which was a majority run English project, but still had huge involvement. And of course, there was a lot of Indian citizens and who were involved in empire. So it's a huge idea. Yeah.